The void was silent, endless, and merciless, yet within that silence the human fleet carried a heartbeat. The ships creaked as if they were ancient bones held together by nothing but stubborn will, their lights flickering against the black sea of stars. Inside the Endeavor, Arya Holt stood by the wide observation window, her reflection pale against the endless dark. Behind her, the hum of the ship was uneven, punctuated by the coughing of old engines and the whispers of families huddled together in narrow corridors. It was supposed to be a journey toward hope, but months of starvation, breakdowns, and death had hollowed even the strongest among them. Still, no one quit. They kept patching holes with scraps, kept planting seedlings in makeshift hydroponic trays, kept telling their children bedtime stories about oceans they would never see again. And then the Cairn appeared, their ship sleek and alien, sliding from the shadows like living blades. Their voices crackled to the translators with a detached warning. Leave, run, survive as we do. Yet Arya refused to accept a future of endless flight. She could not let her people believe they were only ghosts drifting between stars. When the Cairn vanished back into the dark, humanity stayed, clinging to a fractured moon in a dying system. It was madness, yes, but from that madness came sparks. The first domes rose from salvaged hulls, fragile glass shielding green shoots that pushed through poisoned soil. The air smelled faintly of life again, thin and strained but real. Children laughed as they chased each other through tunnels that once reeked of despair. And in the quiet of night, musicians played melodies on instruments carved from wreckage, their songs carrying to the caverns like a promise. Even when the looming shadow of the shroud swallowed distant stars, the people did not falter. They worked with hands blistered and tired, with minds exhausted, yet always with fire inside that no void could smother. And when the Cairn returned, expecting to find wreckage and silence, they instead found lights glowing defiantly against the dead horizon, voices singing and crops pushing toward artificial suns. They asked in disbelief why humanity would fight the inevitable. Arya stood before them, her uniform ragged, her body worn, but her eyes unbroken as she spoke. Because we are human, and we carry tomorrow even into the darkest reaches of space. The Cairn had no answer at first. For centuries, they had lived as exiles in motion, fleeing from the hunger of the shroud, never planting roots, never daring to believe in permanence. To them, survival was a matter of moving faster than death, of retreating always into the next star system before the black tide caught them. But these humans, fragile and short-lived, had chosen the unthinkable. They had stayed, and in staying, they had made something that should not have existed in such a place. Hope. The fractured moon that humanity had claimed was a ruin of rock, its surface cracked from ancient cataclysms, bathed in the pale glow of dying suns. Yet under protective glass of their domes, life had returned. Fields of green stretched in narrow strips, grown from stubborn seeds that clung to poisoned soil. Water filters cobbled together from alien scrap trickled clear streams into makeshift reservoirs. At night, when the storms howled outside, people gathered in the central cavern to tell stories, to laugh, to sing. It was as if they had brought with them not just survival, but a defiance that infected everything around them. Arya Holt watched it unfold with a quiet pride she never allowed herself to show. She had been a soldier once, trained to follow orders, to endure hardship, but never had she expected to become the symbol of a people's will, the weight of it pressed down on her every day. And yet, when she stood before her people, she could not allow them to see her doubts. She walked the corridors, ate the same thin rations, worked alongside engineers and medics, patched leaks and lifted debris with her bare hands. They did not need a commander rank. They needed a leader who bled and endured as they did. The Cairn came again, their ships cutting across the sky like knives, silent but for the hum of engines far beyond human design. This time, they did not come with warnings, but with questions. One of their envoys, tall and faceless behind a mask of shifting crystal, descended into the human settlement. The people gathered, tense but unafraid, watching as the alien voice rippled through the translator. "Why do you resist the truth?" the envoy asked. "The shroud devours all. We have fled it for ages uncounted. Your lights will only draw its hunger." Arya stepped forward, her boots coated in moon dust, her hands streaked with grease from a broken generator she had been repairing. She looked up at the envoy, unflinching. "If we keep running, There will never be anything but the shroud. We will die in motion, empty, forgotten. Here we live. Here we make something worth fighting for. The envoy tilted its head, studying her. You cannot stop it. Even now, the darkness consumes the outer stars of this cluster. You defy inevitability. Maybe, Arya admitted, her voice steady. But inevitability is only certain if you stop trying. We haven't stopped. We won't stop. That's the difference. The crowd murmured in agreement, a low rumble of voices that filled the cavern. For the Cairn, who had long forgotten the sound of hope, it was a strange and unsettling thing. Days later, the envoy returned with others. They watched as humans worked in their fields, as children painted the walls of the domes with crude but colorful murals of Earth's skies and oceans. They observed the way the people built music from scraps of metal and string, the way they laughed even when hungry, the way they stood together when storms tore at the fragile glass above. And slowly, something shifted. The Cairn had once been builders, creators, dreamers. Long ago, before the shroud had driven them into endless exile, they too had planted roots and made homes among the stars. That memory, buried beneath centuries of fear, stirred again as they watched the humans. One evening, as artificial suns dimmed and the settlements glowed softly against the barren rock, a Care approached Arya privately. It removed its crystalline mask, revealing a face thin and angular, its eyes reflecting starlight like pools of liquid silver. You remind us of what we lost, it said softly, almost to itself. You are fragile, yet you endure. Perhaps endurance is not enough. Arya nodded. Survival isn't the same as living. If all we do is run, we're already lost. The Cairn envoy fell silent, as though weighing centuries of choices against a single moment. Finally it asked, if the shroud comes here, what will you do? Arya's answer came without hesitation. We'll fight until there's nothing left to fight with. And maybe that will be enough to find a way no one else has tried. The envoy studied her for a long time, then simply inclined its head. We will watch. Weeks turned into months. The settlements grew stronger, more organized. The humans had learned to adapt to everything the void threw at them. Radiation storms, failing reactors, poisoned soil. And in their stubborn adaptation, they discovered something remarkable. Their scientists found that the shroud, that creeping darkness, was not just a void but a phenomenon, a wave of particles that consumed energy and light. With limited tools, they began to study it, to map it, to search for weaknesses, what no other species had dared to confront. Humanity dared to probe. News spread. Other wandering fleets, broken remnants of civilizations fleeing the shroud, heard whispers of species that had not only refused to run, but had built a home in its shadow. One by one, small groups began to arrive. Insectoid miners who had lost their hives, reptilian traders whose caravans had nowhere left to go, scattered nomads who had never known more than flight. They came to see for themselves the impossible humans who planted green fields in a graveyard of suns. And when they arrived, something extraordinary happened. The humans did not turn them away. They shared food, meager as it was. They shared water, shelter, knowledge. They taught them how to patch leaks, how to build filters from scrap, how to sing when there was nothing else left. For those other refugees, it was the first time they felt more than fear. It was the first time they felt belonging. The Cairn watched, silent, torn between old instinct and a new stirring of memory. They had seen humanity's stubbornness, but now they saw something more dangerous, something more powerful. Hope was spreading not just among humans, but among every species that crossed their path. And hope, once lit, could not easily be extinguished. One night, as the stars shimmered faintly beyond the glass domes, Arya walked the edge of the settlement. She looked out at the barren landscape, at the distant glow of alien fires where newcomers had settled beside humans. She felt the enormity of it pressing down on her, the knowledge that their survival was not just their own anymore. Humanity had become more than refugees. They had become a symbol. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the creeping dark of the shroud, something vast and hungry moved closer. But for the first time since leaving Earth, Arya did not feel fear. She felt ready. Humanity had found hope, even here in the darkest reaches of space. And hope was a weapon the void had never faced before. The shroud announced itself not with a roar, but with silence. One by one, stars on the edge of the system dimmed until they vanished, swallowed whole by an advancing blackness that shimmered faintly, like a veil of liquid shadow stretched across the cosmos. Where it passed, nothing survived, no light, no energy, no trace of matter as it once was. To those who had seen it before, it was death incarnate, patient and unstoppable. The human settlers watched from behind their fragile domes as the stars blinked out. Fear rippled through the camp, even among those who had begun to believe in their impossible fight. Parents held their children close, elders whispered prayers, and new arrivals, aliens who had fled the shroud a dozen times before, felt old instincts screaming at them to run. But the humans did not run, and because of that, no one else did either. Arya Holt stood in the command chamber of their largest dome. Maps of the system projected in flickering blue light around her. Engineers, scientists, and alien envoys filled the room, their voices overlapping in tense argument. Some urged evacuation. Others insisted on building shields, though no shield had ever held before. Only a few spoke of fighting, and even they did so without conviction. Arya raised her voice above the noise. If we run, we'll only delay the inevitable. The shroud has chased every one of you across half the galaxy. It will catch us, too, unless we find another way. We need to understand it. We need to face it. Her words carried weight, not because they were fearless, but because everyone knew she had the same fears they did. She was not immune to despair. She simply refused to surrender to it. That refusal had already changed them all. The Cairn envoy, silver-eyed and solemn, finally spoke. You mean to fight the shroud? With what? Stones and fire? No weapon forge has ever touched it. Then we'll make a new one, Arya replied. It was madness, but humanity thrived in madness. Their scientists, driven by desperation and curiosity in equal measure, had studied fragments from systems already consumed. They discovered patterns in the shroud's advance, anomalies where energy seemed to twist and feed upon itself. Theorists suggested it wasn't a single entity, but a vast field of exotic particles, devouring energy through resonance. If that resonance could be disrupted, even briefly, perhaps it could be resisted. And so they built. The project consumed every scrap of knowledge and material they had. Alien engineers contributed ancient technologies. Mining guilds provided volatile fuels. And human mechanics welded together machines that looked more like nightmares than weapons. At the heart of it all was a reactor designed to pulse with unstable frequencies, a crude attempt to sing against the shroud's hunger. No one knew if it would work. Many believed it would only kill them faster. As the shroud crept closer, the settlement transformed into a hive of furious activity. Nights and days blurred together as welders sparked. Scientists argued, and children carried water to exhausted workers. Fear lingered, but it no longer paralyzed. It drove them. When the black veil finally reached the system's edge, swallowing the first dying sun, the weapon was ready. They called it the Beacon, though it was more bomb than light. It was mounted on a salvage freighter, its hull stripped and reinforced until it was barely space-worthy. Volunteers were called for the mission, and hundreds stepped forward. Humanity had never lacked for courage in the face of impossible odds. Arya chose to crew herself, though many accused her of favoritism when she placed her own name at the top of the list. She silenced them with a single look. If humanity was to face extinction, she would not watch it from the ground. She would stand with those who carried their last hope into the dark. The launch was both grim and glorious. The freighter rumbled away from the moon, its engines coughing as if protesting the impossible weight of destiny on its frame. Inside, humans and aliens sat side by side, staring out at the advancing wall of shadow. The stars ahead were already gone, consumed, leaving only a void that seemed to breathe. As they approached, systems flickered and died. Lights dimmed, instruments failed. The shroud drained power even from a distance. Fear clawed at their throats, but no one turned back. The beacon's core hummed louder, its unstable resonance vibrating through the ship. Arya stood at the forward window, watching the black tide swell until it filled her vision. "This is where we make our stand," she said quietly, though the comms carried her voice back to the settlement. to every dome, to every soul who waited and listened. For too long, the shroud has been inevitability. Today, it meets something else. Our refusal quit. With a final command, she triggered the beacon. The reactor howled. Frequencies lashed out into the void, jagged and discordant, like a scream turned into light. For an instant, nothing changed. The shroud pressed closer, swallowing the space around them, and the ship shuddered under the strain. Then, with a soundless shockwave, the void rippled. The black curtain wavered, like water disturbed by a stone. For the first time in history, the shroud hesitated. Cheers erupted through the comms as readings spiked wildly. The resonance worked. The darkness faltered. But the beacon was unstable. Every scientist had warned it might not last more than minutes. Already, alarms screamed as the reactor overheated. Energy bleeding into the hull. "Pull back," one of the alien engineers shouted. "We bought time, don't waste it." But Aria's eyes remained fixed on the trembling void. She saw it waver, saw cracks of starlight flicker beyond the curtain. And in that moment, she knew retreat was not enough. They had more than time. They had proof that the shroud could be resisted, that inevitability was not absolute. "Not yet," she said, voice steady despite the flames licking through the console. "The galaxy needs more than a moment. It needs hope." She forced the reactor into overdrive. The ship groaned, tearing itself apart, but the beacon's light flared brighter, screaming into the dark. The shroud recoiled. For the first time, it retreated. And then the Endeavor's signal went silent. Back on the moon, thousands stood frozen, staring at the empty feed. The last image they had seen was Aria Holt standing unflinching before the darkness, her face lit by fire and starlight. For a long moment, there was only grief. Then came something stronger. The Cairn raised their heads. The insectoid miners clattered their mandibles in fierce rhythm. The reptilian traders roared, and the humans, weary and battered, lifted their voices together. They had seen the impossible. The shroud could be fought. Aria Holt was gone, but she had left them more than survival. She had left them a weapon, a path, and a fire that burned brighter than the void. In the darkest reaches of space, humanity had not only found hope, they had become it. The weeks after the Endeavor's silence were filled with a strange contradiction, mourning and rebirth. The settlement grieved for Aria Holt and the crew who had gone with her. Songs were sung, memorials etched into steel and stone, and stories retold the moment when humanity stared into the abyss and made it flinch. But grief did not break them, it fueled them. For every tear shed, there was a hand that reached for a tool, a mind that bent toward problem-solving, a heart that refused to surrender. The shroud had been hurt, not destroyed, not even beaten back for long, but hurt. That was enough. Alien envoys carried word across the stars. Where once they had spoken of the shroud in whispers, like a ghost story too terrible to name, they now spoke of it as an enemy, one that could be resisted. For the first time in centuries, messages of hope traveled faster than those of despair. Entire fleets rerouted toward the small moon settlement, not for conquest but for counsel. They wanted to see the humans for themselves, the species that had done the impossible. Ships of every shape descended onto the moon. Crystalline vessels of the Varen, enormous insectoid hive ships of the TRRK, sleek, dart-like craft of the Cairn. They brought resources, knowledge, and above all, questions. Could the beacon be built again? Could it be scaled up? Could it be made stable? The humans didn't have all the answers, but they had something better. They had Aria Holt's last words, her final choice, to burn brighter instead of dimming quietly away. That spirit became the foundation of the Coalition Delight, an alliance that would have been unthinkable only months before, where other species had divided. Bickering over dwindling territory while fleeing the shroud, humanity stitched them together with the thread of defiance. Engineers who once distrusted one another now leaned over the same blueprints. Soldiers who had fought on opposite sides now stood shoulder to shoulder in training halls. For every setback, there was a human voice urging, "Try again. We don't quit." It wasn't easy. The shroud did not wait. It advanced, consuming system after system, forcing refugees to pour into the growing coalition. Each arrival brought both urgency and opportunity. Scientists dissected the data from the Endeavour's final transmission, discovering patterns in the shroud's reaction. The beacon hadn't merely pushed it back. It had forced it into a feedback loop, a momentary loss of cohesion. If enough beacons could be deployed in sequence, perhaps the shroud could be fractured, disrupted across a wider front. So they began to build the arcs of defiance. Unlike the cobbled-together Endeavour, these were purpose-built, great starships, each carrying a beacon cord at heart, wrapped in shielding and bristling with experimental tech from dozens of worlds. The Cairn designed energy siphons to delay the shroud's drain. The Varen wove crystalline amplifiers to strengthen the beacon's resonance. The TRRK filled the holes with swarms of drones, expendable but relentless, meant to distract and harry the shroud's leading edges. And the humans? They brought something no blueprint could capture: audacity. They volunteered in droves, even when told the missions would likely be one way. They trained relentlessly, adapting to alien tech as though born to it. And when exhaustion threatened to break them, they leaned on the same words that had carried Arya Holt to her end. Not yet. Not while we still have a chance. Months passed. The coalition grew. And then came the day when retreat was no longer an option. The shroud's leading edge had reached the Helios cluster, a dense cradle of stars where billions of lives were at stake. If it fell, the loss would cripple half the coalition. The arcs of defiance had to launch. Not tomorrow, not next cycle, but now. 6 massive vessels stood ready, their hulls gleaming under artificial lights. Each bore a name chosen by its crew: Resolve, Firebrand, Aurora, Vigil, Tempest, and Holt's Legacy. The last drew cheers from every throat that could make sound, human or otherwise. Aria's name had become more than history. It was a promise. The fleets assembled, thousands of smaller ships weaving around the great arcs, forming a living shield. As the armada jumped toward the Helios cluster, comms filled with voices, not just orders, but songs, chants, vows. Fear was still there, but it had been transformed, sharpened into something fierce and unyielding. When they arrived, the sight stole every word. The shroud was already there, a tide of black swallowing starlight, rolling toward the first inhabited world of the cluster. Cities below shone like fragile sparks, unaware of how close they were being extinguished. Arcs, form on the line, came the command: this is where we hold. The beacons powered up. Resonance hummed through space. A low vibration felt more in bone than ear. The shroud surged forward, tendrils of darkness stretching like claws. The fleets collided. Drones swarmed into the void, exploding in bright bursts as they sacrificed themselves to buy seconds. Alien weapons, useless in past, now carved temporary gaps where the beacon's resonance had weakened the shroud's cohesion. The arcs themselves burned, systems straining, hulls shuddering, but they held the line. On the bridge of Holt's Legacy, Captain Mira Calder, a woman who had once worked side by side with Arya, stood tall. Her voice carried over every channel. We are the line between the dark and the stars. We don't break. We don't run. We don't quit. Fire the beacon. The resonance struck like a hammer of light. The void rippled. For the first time, entire swaths of the shroud peeled away, retreating under pressure. Gasps and cheers echoed through the fleets. The impossible was happening again, but stronger, clearer, yet the shroud was vast. For every retreat, it surged elsewhere, probing, testing, seeking weakness. The battle became a storm of fire and shadow, of sacrifice and stubbornness. Ships were lost. Thousands gave their lives. But every time the line wavered, a voice rose on the comms, human or alien, shouting the same phrase: not yet. Hours bled into days. The shroud reeled under the coordinated pulses of beacons, and for the first time in living memory, a system did not fall. Instead, the darkness withdrew, shrinking back from the Helios cluster as though stung. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was survival. It was proof that the light could push back the dark. When the fleets limped home, battered but unbroken, they did so as something new, not scattered species clinging to survival, not refugees fleeing inevitable doom. They returned as a united force, a coalition with teeth, and in every ship, in every heart, burned the same truth: Hope was no longer a fragile spark. It was a fire, and humanity, reckless, stubborn, relentless humanity, had taught the galaxy how to keep it burning.